Night shrouded the city, and the dark streets seemed to swallow the last trace of daylight. A cold silence hung in the air, but it was broken by the unnatural roar of a moving car. The flashing lights cut through the gloom, creating red and blue flashes like a nightmare. On the deserted street, where even cab drivers had long ago turned off to avoid getting into trouble, only one man wandered. A boy. A little more than a teenager, but still too young to realize how quickly the world could turn the other way. He didn't notice the approaching car, didn't hear the growling sound of the engine. He was in a hurry. Every movement he made was heavy, every effort an incredible struggle. His leg, as if bound to the ground, could not move quickly, and that made it worse. His disability, which he had so carefully hidden from others, was now his weakness. It shouldn't be like this. Why me? He thought as he paced across the sidewalk, trying not to attract attention. His breathing was getting heavy, and his head, full of thoughts, found no rest. But then he heard it. The engine, the sharp sound of brakes. The car stopped right at his feet. The boy froze, his gaze fixed on the dark windows. His heart beat faster. He didn't know what to do. Intuitively, he went to the street on the dark side, hoping he would disappear into the shadows, but it was too late. The driver was not benevolent. Silently, with a push on the gas, the policeman stepped out of the car, his figure frozen in the dark light like a shadow ready to attack. He said not a word, but his gaze, cold and cruel, quickly fixed on his target. The boy, like an animal in a trap, was on target. "What are you doing here, boy?" The policeman's voice was low, dry as stone. He took a step toward the teenager, not giving him a chance to answer. "Yeah, the boy stammered. His legs were shaking and his gaze kept darting around looking for a way out. Where was that way out? He realized his disability, his physical condition, his skin, it was all his prison now. He was no equal to this policeman. There was no way he could win. The policeman didn't wait for an answer. He grabbed his arm, pulling him violently from his attempt to escape into the shadows. The boy barely held back a cry of pain. The policeman's strength was enough to lift him, and as he fell to the ground, a feeling of helplessness swept over him completely. "You think you mean something, boy? You're nothing." The policeman leaned over, his words climbing into his ears like poisonous needles. He put his foot down on the boy's chest, crushing him completely, not caring about his condition. He didn't see a human being. He saw only an object of humiliation in front of him. "Do you have any idea what's happening to you at all?" The policeman scoffed again, and his voice grew harsher and harsher, full of contempt. The whole scene resembled a terrible ritual. The boy was dizzy, and he felt the world around him shrinking to the size of this cursed place. Couldn't leave, couldn't get up, couldn't even ask for help. He was deprived of even that most basic hope. It wasn't just power, it was contempt. Brutal, hateful contempt. The boy knew his life had changed. But how exactly? Who would help him when even the world seemed to turn away? Everything around him seemed to disappear, leaving only the policeman's heavy breathing and his vile words echoing in the teenager's head. He was like an animal in a cage, completely defenseless, with no power or ability to resist. Each word spoken by the policeman was like a new blow, not to his body, but to his soul. The policeman leaned over, looking down at him. His eyes glittered with anger and contempt. He lifted his foot from the boy's chest and walked over to him, stepping on his shoulder as if this life, this body, this being were nothing, just trash to be wiped out of the way. Do you even realize who you are?" His voice was as angry as a roaring storm. The boy barely heard him, but the policeman's words penetrated his soul like a knife. He couldn't shake off this feeling that his every move, his every look, everything was wrong, that his place in this world didn't exist. "You're not human." The policeman leaned in again, his face very close, and the boy could smell the odor of tobacco and alcohol. It was as if the air around him was made even thicker by the heavy words that were beginning to grate on him. "You're just a creature. You're worth nothing, no value whatsoever. You don't even deserve simple respect." The boy shrank back, his chest clenched with fear and pain. He didn't know how to react. It was too late to ask for help. But what else could he do? He couldn't stand up. His disability made him weak and helpless, but the policeman didn't see that. He only saw the black skin, and apparently there was enough reason to hate it. "Subhuman." The cop said the word as if his very life depended on it, as if it was justification for everything he was doing. He grabbed the teenager by the hair, holding his head against the cold pavement. The boy felt his neck struggle, every muscle in his body clenching in pain, but it was too weak a resistance. "You shouldn't be here," the policeman continued, making no secret of his racism. "Do you even realize how many people would be happy if people like you didn't exist at all?" His words hit the boy like hammers. "You are nothing. You're nothing better than the garbage you carry around with you. I can do anything I want to you, and no one will say a word, because you're just a worthless, pathetic human being." The boy closed his eyes, but the words still reached his consciousness. They didn't just hurt, they killed. He felt each blow of humiliation penetrate deeper into his soul. He couldn't even cry, couldn't even respond. His whole body was paralyzed with fear and pain. The policeman lifted him by the scruff of his neck, as if he were not a human being but a toy to be played with as he pleased. The teenager couldn't breathe, his chest was squeezing, and he couldn't understand why this was happening to him. Why was he in this hell? "You'd probably be better off if you just disappeared. Forever," the policeman said softly, almost like a whisper. But there was a lurking threat in his words that made a chill run through my body. But at that moment, something inside the boy finally woke up. He didn't know what it was, maybe fear, maybe something else, but he felt his arms tense, as if he were gathering all his strength to try to break free. He couldn't afford to be destroyed, even if he was weak, even if it was pointless. It was his only resistance, even though he knew it wouldn't help, that the policeman would just laugh and continue his horrible act. The boy felt he had to hold on, to not completely lose himself, to keep at least a little bit of his humanity in this cruel world. But the words that came out of the policeman's mouth came over him again like a wave. "You're not a human being. You're just a parasite. Get out of my way, or I'll teach you how to be where you belong." He wanted to scream, but he couldn't. Everything was too scary, too painful. Before we continue, let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from. Have you had an experience in your life that can be compared to what we are talking about? Share your thoughts and feelings. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on exciting new experiences. Now, back to our story. A few days passed, but the boy still couldn't get that horrible moment out of his mind when his life had turned into a nightmare for a second. Every movement of his body, every look, every whisper of people around him, everything reminded him of that night. He tried to forget, tried to feel normal again, but reality, like iron fetters, shackled his soul. Externally, his wounds had begun to heal, but internally they were much deeper, and there was no one who could understand his suffering. He could feel the despair settling on his chest like a cold stone. Every day this heaviness became more intolerable. The pain, inflicted not only physically but also verbally, continued to torment his soul. When he looked around at the world around him, he no longer saw anything but shadows. People who once might have been friends now seemed alien to him, aloof. He didn't believe in their kindness, didn't believe in their honesty. Everything around him was a falsity, covered up with beautiful words. Even those who could have supported him were either indifferent or too weak to intervene. Every morning when he woke up, he tried again and again to believe that it was just a nightmare, that this terrible day was just a terrible mistake. But as soon as he got out of bed and looked in the mirror, he didn't see the boy he knew before. He saw the one the policeman had left on the pavement, the one who had been humiliated, the one who had been called nothing. The word subhuman kept echoing in his head. It wasn't just an insult. It was a curse. He no longer felt part of the world. He felt ostracized, rejected, as if his existence didn't matter. The pain he felt the moment his face was pressed to the ground became a part of him. It seeped into him every day, making him doubt himself, his right to be human. He looked at the people in the school, at their laughter and ease, and couldn't understand how they could be so happy. He knew that to them he was just a stranger. No one knew what had happened to him. No one knew what he carried inside him now. He felt his world gradually shrinking, becoming narrower and narrower, and even among his own family he felt like a ghost. His mother, who tried to support him, did not understand what was happening to him. She tried to talk, to find out what was wrong, but he could not open his soul to her. He was afraid that she wouldn't understand, that she wouldn't be able to comprehend the pain he was going through. He was afraid that if she knew the truth, she would just feel even more helpless. His mother had become his shadow, unable to save him. One day, while walking through the park, he saw a group of teenagers laughing and playing. He stopped, trying not to look at them, but something in their laughter made his heart beat faster. It was a reminder that he could no longer be like them. He couldn't be a part of this world. Under his fingernails, he thought he could still feel that pain. The pain of the kick, the pain of the words. And even though his body was healing, his soul remained scarred. He could feel how every word the cop said was eating into his soul, how every action of his was robbing him more and more of his faith in justice. "You're not human." Those words were becoming a verdict for him. That moment when everything he knew collapsed and he found himself on the margins of the world, watching people who didn't notice him go on with their happy lives. With each day since the incident, the world around the boy became more confused and darker. His own life, which still held images of violence, humiliation, and pain, gradually began to reflect a wider societal divide. Although he could neither understand nor realize what was happening, the events around him became increasingly unpredictable and disturbing. News quickly spread the shocking story throughout the city. At first, it was just rumors, then major headlines in local newspapers and television programs that demanded explanations from local authorities. However, as is often the case, neither side presented the whole picture. On one side, there were those who expressed anger, condemning the police officer for his heinous actions. How can this happen in our city? Local activists, human rights activists, and residents demanding justice were asking. Many people demanded an investigation, calling for punishment for those involved in the beating of the teenager. But, on the other hand, there was another group, those who sided with the policeman. They accused the boy of provoking the situation, that his behavior was inadequate, and that his disability only played a role in his disrespect for laws and regulations. The policeman was doing his job, they said. All these stories are just a figment of overblown public hysteria. For them, the boy was just part of an inevitable order, and his suffering was just a side effect. While the community was divided, unsure of how to properly respond, no one suspected that behind the whole story lay something much darker and more complex. The policeman, as they soon began to discover, was not just a violent man. He turned out to be part of a far more dangerous system, a network that had long been beyond the bounds of law and morality. These were dark forces, and they began to cover up his actions, protecting not only him, but also himself. It was said that this policeman was just a pawn in a game, behind which were powerful personalities hidden behind the curtain of power. Whispers that such cases could be extinguished with the help of friends in high places were beginning to turn into frank conversations. People talked about how some politicians, local businessmen, and even judges could help such criminals evade responsibility by protecting them through their influence and connections. The boy had no idea how deep this story went. He could only feel society beginning to tighten its ring around him. Unlike all those who condemned the policeman or supported him, he found himself in the center, where his story was just a fragment of something much darker. He became not just a victim of violence, but part of a political symbol, a target for all those who were looking for a way to get their share of the benefits of the conflict. Where he felt only emptiness and pain, others saw an opportunity for manipulation. A divided society, and now a divided government, could not find a point of agreement. Only a few sought the truth, but those who went after it soon found that the truth was far from what it seemed on the surface. Like a fog that spreads, swallowing everything in its path, rumors of dark forces began to gain strength. The boy couldn't get enough of those conversations, those speculations. He knew his story was part of something far more terrifying than he could have imagined. Some began to whisper that this policeman was just a pawn, and those who controlled him continued to lurk in the shadows, eliminating anything that could threaten their secrets. The boy felt his life changing again. He had become part of something bigger than just a personal tragedy. His story was now the story of the city, and his every move was being watched by those who hid their faces. That didn't make it any easier. On the contrary, the feeling of loneliness only grew stronger. He realized that he had not only been left behind, but turned into an object for someone else's games, someone else's politics. The shadows on the horizon began to thicken. The system that was supposed to protect him wasn't on his side at all. Each day in the house became more and more burdensome. The ordinary life they had once known was mercilessly crumbling, as if an invisible force was causing it to fall apart. The boy sat in his room, looking out the window at a bright world that seemed so far away, as if they were scenes from a movie. It wasn't like that in his mind. There were only dark and heavy thoughts in his soul that wouldn't let him go for a second. His mother, Elizabeth, grew more and more anxious every day. She became more and more worried about his mental state, but despite her best efforts, the boy did not want to open up. She saw how his eyes became blank, how he no longer shared his worries with her. She tried to talk, tried to understand what was going on, but her son was no longer the open and lively teenager he had been before the terrible incident. "You can trust me. I'll help you," she was saying, but it was as if her words didn't reach him. All he could answer was a short, "I'm fine." He didn't want to upset her further. He didn't want her to feel like her world was shattered. But her eyes, full of worry and despair, still wouldn't leave him alone. But the worst of it was that his father, Nicholas, a man whom everyone considered balanced and strong, with firm principles, seemed not to notice anything. He was absorbed in his work and did not pay attention to what was happening in the family. He often came home late, absorbed in matters that were not discussed at the table. He avoided talking about what had happened to their son, as if to shut himself off from the subject. Elizabeth knew something was wrong. She could feel their relationship with her husband becoming more and more strained. Every time she tried to talk to him about their son, he answered evasively, as if he didn't see it as important. "He has to be strong. He's a man," Nicholas said, looking away. He didn't believe in tears, didn't believe in weakness. There was only determination and strict discipline in his eyes. But what he didn't know was that his son was crumbling before his eyes. "You just look at him." Elizabeth couldn't stand it one day, standing in the doorway of her husband's office. "He's going through something terrible, and you don't even notice it." Nicholas looked up from his papers, and his face turned cold, almost stony. He didn't want to talk about it. He was too busy maintaining his reputation, keeping his place in society, than dealing with this. "He'll get over it. I know how to raise men," he said with confidence, but his voice sounded too hard. Elizabeth stood for a moment at a loss. She couldn't understand why her husband was ignoring their son's suffering, why he couldn't see what was happening. Her anxiety was growing. Then, one day, when they were alone at home, Elizabeth suddenly heard something that would change everything. She casually glanced into Nicholas's office, hoping that he might be able to relax at least a little. But when she went in, she saw him talking to a man she'd never met before. A man in a strict suit sat across from Nicholas and whispered about something, his face hidden in the semi-darkness. Elizabeth remained in the doorway, hesitant to enter. She felt her heart sink, and something inside told her that she had just witnessed something she shouldn't have. This conversation wasn't about business, it was something else. Dark, influential. The man was talking about a situation that needed to be closed. Nicholas, as strange as it sounded, didn't seem surprised. On the contrary, his reaction was too calm for it not to arouse suspicion. He didn't argue. He didn't object. He merely said, "We'll solve it. It's under control." And then Elizabeth realized what she had heard was not just a matter of a closed life. She realized that her husband was hiding far more serious things than she had ever imagined. He was connected to powerful people, those who decided who would pay for his mistakes and how, and he was probably in the thick of things. But the worst discovery was yet to come. Elizabeth realized that her husband, this confident, stern man, was not just a protector of her son. He was part of a system that could turn a blind eye to anything, including violence and corruption. His silence was part of the game, part of what they were hiding. Elizabeth felt her world crumble. This man she loved was actually part of something much bigger, something darker. She began to realize that her family was more than just less than perfect. They were caught up in dark games that there was no escaping. From that moment on, Nicholas's every look became intense to her. His every action seemed hidden behind a veil, and she began to realize that her family was consumed by a system from which there was no escape. Night. The house was quiet, but for Elizabeth the silence was unbearable. She sat at the table where the papers were still scattered, papers she had secretly collected in the last few days. Every word, every line of those papers was connected to secrets she could not ignore. She was ready to find out the truth at any cost. She felt that she was losing control of the situation more and more. Nicholas continued to lead his life without noticing what was happening in their house. The boy was silent, his heartache deepening with each passing day. Elizabeth realized that she had to act. She could no longer stay on the sidelines. But what she discovered shocked her to the core. It had started with a simple coincidence. She had come across the name of the policeman, the same one who had humiliated her son in one of the old court cases that lay among the papers on Nicholas's desk. For a long time, she couldn't figure out why the man's name was so familiar. And then, as she began to dig deeper, she realized this policeman wasn't just any policeman. He was connected to the system itself, to people she knew nothing about. The unknown name she soon led to specific individuals turned out to be connected to several influential figures in the city. These people were at the head of large business structures, had access to political and judicial decisions. She couldn't believe that in this small town where everyone knew each other, there lurked such a network that indicted everything, including the law. The teen's mother discovered that the police officer at the center of her tragedy was not a random perpetrator. He was part of a larger and more obscurantist scheme. Businessmen, judges, high-ranking police officers, all of these people were connected through old connections, through mutual interests and business arrangements. It all became part of a secret world in which her family played no role, but merely became a pawn in someone else's larger game. Elizabeth discovered that her husband, Nicholas, was part of this circle. He may not have been directly involved in the crimes, but his silence and closed eyes spoke much. He knew what was being discussed, but he chose to stay out of it. He continued to pretend that nothing was going on while things were happening under his nose that could have changed everything. Afraid to admit it to herself, Elizabeth realized that her husband was not only a witness, but part of this dark web. Her hands trembled as she looked through photos, articles, and documents, discovering more and more details with each step. The dark forces that she had thought were hidden from the eyes of ordinary people were now so close. She knew that if this information fell into the hands of journalists, the entire structure behind this policeman and her husband could collapse. But who was prepared for that? Who would believe such a story if she told it? And, most importantly, who could have stopped this machine she was just beginning to sort out? With each passing hour, her own thoughts became more and more confused. Images of what had happened to her son, what had happened to her family kept flashing through her mind. All the things that had been hidden for years were now in front of her, like a book unfolding in its final pages. But the more she knew, the more she realized that her life would never be the same again. The boy continued to suffer from nightmares. His mental state was getting worse. Every time she tried to talk to him, he shut down even more. He no longer saw a place for himself in this world. He had lost faith not only in people, but in himself. His life, as it seemed to her, was broken, and he couldn't find a way out. Elizabeth could feel the emptiness beginning to grow in her heart. She couldn't wait any longer. She knew she had to act. But the more she dug into the past, the more horrible facts were revealed to her. She discovered that those who defended the policeman were not defending him for justice, but to cover up much darker deeds. This game with fate, this shadowy power, it all stretched much further than she could have imagined. Who was at the center of it all? Who was behind her husband's back, behind the policeman's back? And what should she do with this information now, knowing that the truth could cost a life? Before we continue, let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from, whether you have had something similar in your life, and how you feel about what is happening in our story. Share your thoughts. If you're interested in our stories, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new events. Now, back to our story. Elizabeth sat in the dark room, her eyes flickering dimly from the light of the lamp. The documents she was studying were spread out before her in disarray, but something in the chaos was beginning to form a picture she couldn't imagine. With each passing hour, her mind became more and more consumed by this horrible discovery. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. She had always known that her husband, Nicholas, was an important man in their town. He was a respected judge, with years of experience and a good reputation. But she hadn't known how closely intertwined his ties were with those behind their son's incident. What she was trying to understand now was so devastating that every breath she took felt like a harbinger of disaster. The documents she gathered showed more than just Nicholas's role in the case. She discovered correspondence, hidden notes that confirmed her husband wasn't just acquainted with the cop who had beaten their son. He was his defense attorney. He was one of the people who repeatedly raised issues in court to justify this police officer's actions. He used his influence to cover up the truth. "How could you?" Elizabeth whispered under her breath. She couldn't believe it. She'd found court reports where Nicholas had repeatedly claimed that the cop had acted within the law, that his aggressive actions were necessary to maintain order. But it wasn't just an excuse. It was a cover-up. Faced with the truth, Elizabeth felt her world begin to crumble. All these years, all his words about justice, about fighting for the law, it was just a facade that hid not only his own weakness, but also a much darker side. Not only was he part of this cycle of violence, he was deeply involved in the system that sustained it. And now she realized her husband wasn't just a silent spectator. He was an accomplice. That evening was a catharsis for her. She realized that her life, all these years, had been built on lies. He had always been there for her, but now Elizabeth could feel how he had become a stranger. When she finally looked into his eyes, she realized that his gaze was no longer the one she had once loved. It was the look of a man hiding his true motives. At that moment, Elisabetta felt her world split open. She could have just remained silent like everyone else. She could have continued to live with this hidden knowledge and closed her eyes to what was happening. But she couldn't. Not after what their son had been through. Not after seeing what this system had led to. She knew she had a choice to make now, but the choice was not an easy one. When Nicholas came home late that night, Elizabeth couldn't help herself. She stood up, walked over to him, and placed one of the documents she had found in front of him. He saw her face contorted with pain and felt a chasm forming between them. "You knew everything, didn't you?" Her voice was steady, but you could hear the pain in it. "You protected him. You protected his actions. You knew what he did to our son, and you kept quiet. You were part of it." Nicholas froze. He didn't know what to say. His face was stony, his hands clenched into fists. "You don't understand," he started to say, but Elizabeth interrupted him. "No, you don't understand." She raised her voice, but her words were filled with anger as well as despair. "You've ruined everything. You ruined our family. You ruined his life. You were part of this dirty game, and I didn't know." Nicholas stood there, unable to move. He knew he couldn't justify himself. All he could do was remain silent. But that silence was the worst truth for Elizabeth. He was part of what had destroyed their son. And now, when she looked at him, she no longer saw the man she loved. "Do you really want me to go on living with this?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them spill over. "You want me to support you in this?" Nicholas, unable to answer, looked away. He knew he'd lost her. He knew he'd lost his family. All that was left now was to realize in the face of her despair that he had lost everything that was important to him. Elizabeth couldn't stay with him any longer, not after what she'd learned, not after what had happened to their son. And though Nicholas probably still didn't realize the depth of what they'd been through, for Elizabeth, that moment was crucial. From that moment on, she made a decision. She could not be a part of this system. She had to protect her son, no matter how scary it was for her. It had been several days since Elizabeth and Nicholas had come face to face with the truth. Each morning, each night awakening became even more unbearable for the boy. His thoughts were ravaged like a field through which a storm had passed. The truth he now knew about his father kept him awake. He could not understand how all this could have happened, how the man whom he had regarded as a support and protector could have been so deeply involved. He couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. Everything he'd experienced, all the humiliation and pain, was just part of something more terrible. His father was not just a silent bystander, he was an active participant in this dark game. The policeman who had treated him so cruelly was just a pawn in a vast system, and his father was part of that system. Every glance at Nicholas now was like a knife in his heart. With every conversation with him, with every calm answer, the boy felt the last fortress that had once held them together crumbling. His father, with his confidence and strength, seemed like a stranger now. What had recently been his protection was now the very thing that threatened his life and inner peace. The boy didn't know how to fight it. He didn't know how to confront his own man, didn't know how to keep himself safe in the face of all this truth. The inner conflict in him grew more and more intense every day. He withdrew more and more into himself, losing faith in people, in the system, in the very possibility of justice. He felt his psyche, like cracking wood, begin to break under the weight of the revelations he had to accept. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't push away the thought, maybe this is all an inevitability. Maybe there's no room for truth in this world. Meanwhile, Elisabetta and Nicholas, as if existing in parallel realities, continued their silent existence. They avoided direct conversation, avoided what would have been an imminent conflict. But for the boy, there was no escape, no refuge. His mental state was deteriorating and his nightmares were becoming more vivid. Every night was a torture for him. He relived over and over again that moment when the policeman stood over him, humiliated him, and now images of violence and disappointment in his father merged in his mind. As the boy delved into his inner world, Elizabeth realized more and more that she could not leave this situation unchanged. She could no longer go back to the way things were. But Nicholas still remained with his eyes closed, continuing to defend the system that had not only destroyed their son, but his own life as well. Elizabeth decided she needed to take action, and so, one evening, the boy faced what he had so feared, a direct confrontation with his father. When Nicholas entered his room, he felt a tension in the air that was almost palpable. The boy was sitting on the bed, his gaze blank but determined. He didn't know how to begin, but he knew that this conversation had to be the last, the decisive, the final one. "Why did you do it?" His voice was quiet, but sharp as a knife blade. He couldn't hold it in any longer. Nicholas froze for a moment, his eyes full of surprise, but quickly returned to the same stony expression that was so familiar. He was looking at his son, but he didn't seem to see him. "What do you mean?" he replied, as if he didn't know what he was talking about. "You were part of it all." The boy jumped up from the bed, his chest heaving with anger. "You were protecting him. You protected the one who humiliated me." The words fell on Nicholas like heavy stones. He looked at his son, but his face remained impenetrable. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to explain why he had done this. But now that his son stood before him with such outright anger and frustration, he could no longer hide the truth. "You don't understand." His voice shook, but he quickly pulled himself together. "It's not as easy as you think. I did all this to protect you, to protect our family. It's not all one-sided in this world." "You protected them," shouted the boy, feeling everything inside him boiling. "You protected the system that destroyed me. You protected those who continue to do this to others. How could you?" Nicholas stood, his eyes now full of pain. But that pain was not from what he had done, but from the realization that his son had seen right through him. He didn't know what to say. Every excuse he made was empty. He realized he had lost his son. The boy continued to look at his father, but now there was something new in his eyes. Not just anger, but despair. He felt his world crumbling, everything that had once seemed right disappearing. Everything he knew about love, about family, about safety. Now it was distorted and overshadowed by the horror of the truth. And so, at the peak of this deadly struggle for the truth, the boy realized he could no longer live in this world of lies. He had to leave. He couldn't be around the man who had become part of this dark game, part of those who were leading him to the edge. He had to choose himself, choose his future, even if it meant losing what was left of his family. He headed for the door, feeling his heart beating hard in his chest. Nicholas didn't try to stop him. He realized that all was lost. Everything he had built was now ruined. He had lost everything he held dear. From the moment the truth of Nicholas's actions began to spread through the town, the community was in a state of shock. At first, it was just a whisper, a quiet conversation among the locals. But every day, with each new testimony and revelation, the rumors grew louder. The local media, accustomed to silencing uncomfortable issues, could no longer stay away. They began publishing stories exposing Nicholas's ties to the police force, to businessmen, to those who controlled the city from the shadows. With each new report, each new confirmation, the unimaginable story became even more convoluted, and those who had remained silent until now were forced to ask themselves the question, how long will we remain silent? Elizabeth, despite all her pain, made the decision not to back down. She knew that now that all these secrets had come to light, she couldn't just leave it at that. She became the face of the resistance. Her son, even though he had left her, even though he was shutting himself away, still couldn't escape what was happening in their town. He was part of that history. His life was part of this struggle. There was only one thing Elizabeth could do: fight for the truth, fight for justice. The noise and rage that was building up in the city was an inevitable consequence of what had happened. People could no longer turn a blind eye to what they had seen. Journalists began to come to Elizabeth, asking about the details of her discovery. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. She couldn't hide the truth. even if it meant losing everything she knew. Meanwhile, Nicholas, strangely enough, stayed where he was. His career as a judge continued despite all the revelations. He maintained that he had done nothing wrong. He still defended the system that had educated him, a system in which he had always been confident. But now his confidence was cracking at the seams. People began to talk openly about him. His reputation that had been built over the years began to crumble. Nicholas was no longer seen as a defender of the law, but as a man who covered up crimes, a man who was now accused of patronizing violence. Every morning as he left the house, he felt the stares. People now looked at him as a criminal, as someone who had betrayed his family, his people. Threats began to be made against him. Anonymous calls were made to him. Letters were left demanding his resignation. But his pride and determination wouldn't let him give up. He couldn't let everything he had built crumble. However, Elisabetta was not going to back down. She went to court, to the police, trying to get an investigation. She realized that her chance of success was slim, but she also realized that now that the truth had been revealed, she could not afford to keep quiet. She began to gather more and more evidence. More and more people began to come to her with information. More and more witnesses began to open their eyes to the crimes that had been covered up. Every day, the confrontation between the supporters of Nicholas and those who demanded justice became more and more intense. This was not just a matter of one man, it was a matter of the whole city, the whole system that truly controlled the government. People wondered, how long would this system continue to cover up crimes? How many more unpunished acts of violence would be hidden under the mask of justice? And then came the moment when the commission came to town. This wasn't just a routine inspection. It was a federal commission sent to investigate Judge Nicholas and his ties to the police officer. Elizabeth, despite all her pain, took part in these hearings, growing more determined and stronger each day. She couldn't let this opportunity go. She couldn't let it all be forgotten. Nicholas, as usual, remained confident. He came to the meeting with the same expression on his face with which he had always viewed the world, as if he were above all these people, as if he were not afraid. He looked like a man who didn't know what it meant to be on the side of those fighting for the truth. To him, this was just another problem to solve, another obstacle to overcome. But when Elisabetta stood up to testify and told her version of events, when she said how her son had been humiliated, how his rights had been violated, when she spoke of the connections she had uncovered, the tension in the room became unbearable. People began to react. There were new witnesses, new evidence. Nicholas's power and fame began to crumble like a house of cards. However, the worst was ahead. Not everyone was ready to accept the truth. Many continued to defend it, hiding everything that was hidden. There were those who were willing to go to any lengths to protect the system, to protect those at the helm. Elizabeth knew it would not be an easy fight. She knew that many were willing to pay a high price for leaving things as they were. Meanwhile, the boy who had left home long ago had returned. He could no longer be around those who were silent. He knew that his father would not change. He knew that his life had been ruined not only by the actions of the police officer, but also by how deep the corruption had penetrated their family. But he also knew that if he didn't fight for the truth, someone else would continue to do all these things to other people. Every day it became more and more obvious that everything was at stake. This was not just a personal tragedy, not just one man's case. It was a matter for the whole system, the whole city. And in this moment, When everyone was faced with the choice of staying silent or speaking out against what was hidden, only the truth could set them free. But could they win when such a powerful system resisted? Court hearings, investigations, speeches, open accusations. All this became part of the daily reality of the city. Each day brought new revelations, new evidence that shattered the last semblance of order. But, despite all efforts, the truth, as always, was under the veil. What seemed close to justice was so far away that many were beginning to lose hope. Elizabeth didn't know what she expected, what she was looking for, but one thing was certain. Nothing was ever the same again. The story of her son, of how he had been humiliated, did not end with simple justice. Instead, she was facing systemic resistance, those who were willing to do anything to hide the truth, to maintain their positions. Nicholas continued to fight for his career. He wasn't going to quit, despite the pressure and threats. He knew his position was precarious, but his determination would not let him give up. He still maintained that everything he did was for the preservation of order and law. But his words no longer resonated with the community. Everything that had supported him was crumbling. Friends, colleagues, even those who had been by his side for years now began to look at him with suspicion. Rumors, testimonies, evidence, it all became his stumbling block. Meanwhile, the boy who survived that violent incident was far away from his family, trying to gather his thoughts. He was searching for answers, but didn't know where to find them. He was broken, like a man who had survived a war, but he couldn't go home. The home that had once been a fortress to him was now a place of pain and destruction. He couldn't forgive his father. He couldn't forgive those who had supported him. He knew the world around him was broken, but despite his isolation, he couldn't be part of this game, this system that had betrayed him. One evening, when Elizabeth was in the house, she received a phone call. It wasn't the call she was expecting. It was from a local journalist who told her that the Federal Human Rights Commission had decided to suspend the investigation into Nicholas. Everything they had accumulated, all the evidence, all the revelations, had not been enough to bring about change. The city was ready to go on with its normal life, and no one cared about what was happening anymore. It was too expensive, too politically sensitive. Elizabeth couldn't believe what she was hearing. She knew that the system she lived in was rotten, but she still hoped that the truth would be heard. Now her hope was dashed. The moment she hung up the phone, the world around her became cold and empty again. She realized that all her efforts had been in vain. The commission, the authorities, the police, the courts, they were all defending the system, and no one was willing to change what had been built up over the years. The truth was there, right in front of them, but they were too high up to see it. But the biggest blow came when Elizabeth saw her son. He had come home, but his face was contorted with pain and anger. He had been through his own personal struggle, and now he saw it all crumbling. But despite his hatred for his father and everything that had happened, he was once again in the midst of this disaster. "Mom, what are we going to do now?" His words were full of despair. He didn't know how to live in this world where truth was pushed to the wayside. But when Elizabeth stood up to testify and told her version of events, when she said how her son had been humiliated, how his rights had been violated, when she spoke of the connections she had uncovered, the tension in the room became unbearable. People began to react. There were new witnesses, new evidence. Nicholas's power and fame began to crumble like a house of cards. However, the worst was ahead. Not everyone was ready to accept the truth. Many continued to defend it, hiding everything that was hidden. There were those who were willing to go to any lengths to protect the system, to protect those at the helm. Elizabeth knew it would not be an easy fight. She knew that many were willing to pay a high price for leaving things as they were. Meanwhile, the boy who had left home long ago had returned. He could no longer be around those who were silent. He knew that his father would not change. He knew that his life had been ruined not only by the actions of the police officer, but also by how deep the corruption had penetrated their family. But he also knew that if he didn't fight for the truth, someone else would continue to do all these things to other people. Every day it became more and more obvious that everything was at stake. This was not just a personal tragedy, not just one man's case. It was a matter for the whole system, the whole city. And in this moment, when everyone was faced with the choice of staying silent or speaking out against what was hidden, only the truth could set them free. But could they win when such a powerful system resisted? Court hearings, investigations, speeches, open accusations. All this became part of the daily reality of the city. Each day brought new revelations, new evidence that shattered the last semblance of order. But, despite all efforts, the truth, as always, was under the veil. What seemed close to justice was so far away that many were beginning to lose hope. Elizabeth didn't know what she expected, what she was looking for, but one thing was certain. Nothing was ever the same again. The story of her son, of how he had been humiliated, did not end with simple justice. Instead, she was facing systemic resistance, those who were willing to do anything to hide the truth, to maintain their positions. Nicholas continued to fight for his career. He wasn't going to quit, despite the pressure and threats. He knew his position was precarious, but his determination would not let him give up. He still maintained that everything he did was for the preservation of order and law. But his words no longer resonated with the community. Everything that had supported him was crumbling. Friends, colleagues, even those who had been by his side for years now began to look at him with suspicion. Rumors, testimonies, evidence, it all became his stumbling block. Meanwhile, the boy who survived that violent incident was far away from his family, trying to gather his thoughts. He was searching for answers, but didn't know where to find them. He was broken, like a man who had survived a war, but he couldn't go home. The home that had once been a fortress to him was now a place of pain and destruction. He couldn't forgive his father. He couldn't forgive those who had supported him. He knew the world around him was broken, but despite his isolation, he couldn't be part of this game, this system that had betrayed him. One evening, when Elizabeth was in the house, she received a phone call. It wasn't the call she was expecting. It was from a local journalist who told her that the Federal Human Rights Commission had decided to suspend the investigation into Nicholas. Everything they had accumulated, all the evidence, all the revelations, had not been enough to bring about change. The city was ready to go on with its normal life, and no one cared about what was happening anymore. It was too expensive, too politically sensitive. Elizabeth couldn't believe what she was hearing. She knew that the system she lived in was rotten, but she still hoped that the truth would be heard. Now her hope was dashed. The moment she hung up the phone, the world around her became cold and empty again. She realized that all her efforts had been in vain. The commission, the authorities, the police, the courts, they were all defending the system, and no one was willing to change what had been built up over the years. The truth was there, right in front of them, but they were too high up to see it. But the biggest blow came when Elizabeth saw her son. He had come home, but his face was contorted with pain and anger. He had been through his own personal struggle, and now he saw it all crumbling. But despite his hatred for his father and everything that had happened, he was once again in the midst of this disaster. "Mom, what are we going to do now?" His words were full of despair. He didn't know how to live in this world where truth was pushed to the wayside.